Now that we've been through the action of steroid and non-steroid hormones, or water-soluble and non-water-soluble hormones, we're going to dive into some of the particular endocrine structures found in the body, and two of the really important ones are the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So in this lesson we are going to focus on these two structures, and we will mention some hormones, but the focus of today is not the hormones themselves, it is much more on the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So to start us off, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is found in this small section of the brain that I've just highlighted in yellow. The hypothalamus is the structure found on top, and then it is connected via a structure known as the infundibulum. This infundibulum is what connects the hypothalamus directly to the two lobes of the pituitary gland. Firstly, there is the anterior pituitary gland, which is found facing the front of the body, and then in orange we have the other part of the pituitary gland facing the back, and that is known as the posterior pituitary. When we talk about the hypothalamus, it's important to recognise that it has a role in not only the endocrine system, but also in the nervous system as well. It's important for many functions found throughout the body, and one of note is temperature regulation or thermoregulation, which we will talk about later in the year. Now, for today, we are going to focus on the hypothalamus as an endocrine organ. And we can think of the hypothalamus as an endocrine organ as it produces three key things. Number one, it produces inhibiting factors, which are particularly important with the anterior pituitary gland. It also releases releasing factors, again targeting the anterior pituitary gland. And lastly, it is the site where hormones may be released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary. It is where these hormones come from. So, when we talk about the pituitary gland now, the structure located below the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland is a very small pea-sized structure, and it is attached, as we mentioned, to the hypothalamus by this stalk known as the infundibulum. Now, when we talk about the pituitary gland, again, it has both an anterior and a posterior lobe. And although the pituitary gland is under its own control or under its own function, it is under the control of the hypothalamus. So everything that happens to the pituitary gland happens because of messaging from that hypothalamus. So another representation here, feel free to pause, but we're going to move on for now. This is the one found in your textbook, and it's going to be particularly important for us to come back to throughout the course of the year to really see how that hypothalamus is connected to the anterior and posterior lobe slightly differently. So what we can see up the top, and the key part before we move on to our next slide, is that in the hypothalamus we have, I'm circling them in yellow now, all of these neurosecretory cells. So let's talk a little bit about them. Neurosecretory cells are a particular type of cell found in the hypothalamus, and these cells found in the hypothalamus are what produce hormones in the cell body. Okay? And the cell body of this particular one is this area that we can see in yellow here. Now, these hormones are then packaged and transported along the axon, which is the long body of the neurosecretory cell, and the hormone is held in the axon terminal, where it is eventually released in the bloodstream. This occurs due to a nervous or neural stimulation. So let's talk about the anterior lobe. The anterior lobe has no nerves, okay? No nerves connecting to the hypothalamus. Instead, it's connected to the hypothalamus by this thing known as the hypophyseal portal system, which is a series of blood vessels. We can see this really clearly indicated in the diagram over on the left here, where we can see the hypophyseal portal system and its extensive network of blood vessels. This is what innervates the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice that this hypophyseal portal system does connect into the hypothalamus. And it's the hypothalamus again which controls the anterior lobe by producing and secreting the releasing and inhibiting factors. These factors are secreted into the blood, they carry through that portal system, and eventually they make it to the anterior lobe. This is not the hormone, however. This is simply another hormone, or in this case what we will refer to them as releasing and inhibiting factors, which tells the cells of the anterior pituitary it is time to start secreting some particular hormones. So what are these hormones? Well, on this slide here, we can see that there are 6 main hormones that we need to know which are secreted by the anterior pituitary. Some that you will recognise from year 11 include follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. Some new ones for you this year include growth hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Moving on, we now get to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is connected by these neurosecretory cells. Now, the posterior lobe is not referred to as a true endocrine gland because it does not create its own hormones. Instead, it is a site of storage for hormones before they are released around the body. But where do these hormones come from? These hormones are produced, as we mentioned, in the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. The hormones are then carried down the axon of the neurosecretory cell, where they make it to the posterior pituitary gland. Here, they're going to be stored in the axon terminal, and then when a nervous stimulation arrives, these neurosecretory cells will then release these hormones. So the hormones of note in this case, one will be familiar from last year, which is oxytocin, and a new one for year 12 will be antidiuretic hormone. So when we look at another representation, and our final one for today, we can see the following. When we talk about the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which I'll highlight over on the left in yellow, we can see that firstly, neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are what produce the releasing and inhibiting hormones. They travel into the hypophyseal portal network system, and we can see that connection here. They then lead to the release of hormones from anterior pituitary cells. And these hormones are not the same as the inhibiting or releasing hormones secreted by neurosecretory cells. On the right-hand side of the diagram, we have the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And here, as we just mentioned, neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus produce 2 particular hormones, those being oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They are then held in the axon terminal of the neurosecretory cell until they're ready to be released into some of the capillaries found in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and then they will be released around the body.